session. It took me an hour and 2 minutes to get here. It's just great being a Buddhist. I'm so happy. So around Labor Day, I think Labor Day Sunday, we had a funeral at OCBC, a huge funeral for Reverend Doami, who passed. And he was one of the three ministers when I first came to OCBC. And I think all of the three ministers that I kind of grew up with, I mean, I was 39, but I grew up. I was 1 year old as far as being Buddhist. I grew up with Reverend Miyagi as head minister. I didn't even know there were head ministers back then. But Reverend Miyagi was the head minister. And then Reverend Narada was resident minister. And then Reverend Doami, I didn't know this either because I always saw him on Sunday, but he was a part-time minister, like I was before September 1st. So, I used Reverend Doami as kind of a model. He worked a full-time job and was a part-time minister. And I was like, wow, you could do that? So, I really learned a lot from him, that was a possible path. And I took that path and ultimately became a full-time minister. And he also gave a lot of Dharma talks using, it was kind of amazing, really. It seemed like he would wake up on a Sunday morning, have his coffee, open up the comics, and read the comic strip and find something. Usually it was Calvin and Hobbes. And then he would come and he would give that Dharma talk. And I forgot to mention this at OCBC, but another way Reverend Doami influenced me is that I figured if you could do Dharma talks on everyday life, from comic strips, I mean, you can find Buddhism in comic strips, then I thought, well, you could find Buddhism in moving pictures too, right? Like in movies, DVDs. And I started to look at music. So he really opened up this idea that you should be able to find the Dharma in your everyday life. A lot of people say when they leave church they don't know what to do. But, you open up the paper and you see Calvin and Hobbes, it's right there. So he would give Dharma talks a lot on Calvin and Hobbes. And here Calvin and Hobbes are looking a little sad because they lost a very good friend in Reverend Doami. They don't look very animated. They're very sad. So this is one of the last pictures Reverend Doami took, and this is in the formal robes. These are the formal robes we wear at special services. And they're called shikie. The A part refers to robe, and shiki means colored. So my robe is green, so I assumed shiki meant green. But it just means any color, any color. So, and what Reverend Doami mostly talked about, and he wrote a Korean article in our church newspaper every month, was called A Way of Seeing. And he found Calvin and Hobbes to be one of those unique pieces of art that changed the way we see things. It was always challenging us to see things in different ways. And I wanted to mention that in February and March of 2014, I started to have an email dialogue with Reverend Doami. And because I wanted to kind of honor him, I actually wrote this Dharma talk, this PowerPoints from 2014, and I sent it to him, and he looked it over. And he said, it's good, you pick good comics, but I had like 6 or 8 strips in here. And he said, it's good, but you've got way too much stuff in your talks. He said, if you're going to be a minister for 20 years or 15 years, you're going to run out of material. I mean, really fast. I mean, he said, you've got 6 talks in this PowerPoint. So I actually checked the timestamps and the emails, and he actually reviewed this Dharma talk, edited it, and approved it. And I wanted to mention that Calvin and Hobbes was a daily comic strip by American cartoonist Bill Watterson. And I got my dates a little bit confused, and I wanted to make sure I had this right. The comic strip was syndicated from November of 1985 to December of 1995, so 10 years. But I remember reading it long after that. And I found out in 2010, it was so popular, they started rerunning the comic strip in 50 different countries. So I think this is when I mainly read Calvin and Hobbes, was the reruns in 2010. And these were the ones that Reverend Doami was reading, and he brought to OCBC to give Dharma talks. It was in 50 countries, and they've sold over 45 million copies of various Calvin and Hobbes books. And they claim that Calvin and Hobbes is considered to be the last great American comic strip. So that's kind of a big honor because comic strips are kind of gone now. Newspapers are gone. So this is considered the last great comic strip, maybe in the tradition of Peanuts and Snoopy. So I wanted to show you, kind of like the selected words by Shimron, number 3. In our tradition, a suffering and insight are kind of two sides of the same coin. So we'll see how Calvin and Hobbes kind of have an existential problem. They always have these deep problems. And then they tend to resolve it through insight and wisdom. And so that's what we mean by light in that quote, that wisdom overwhelms the foolishness or the drama or the difficulties in our lives. So here's kind of an initial understanding of change in Buddhism. Calvin says, I thrive on change. And he says, you? You threw a fit this morning because your mom put less jelly on your toast than yesterday. Linda makes me peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, and she only uses 1 teaspoon of jelly. So, I thrive on making other people change. So this is a lot of times how people first begin to understand Buddhism. It's a way of getting other people to change, when really we focus on ourselves, that we change, and that we're ultimately the source of our unhappiness and the source of our happiness. And so here's kind of the flip side of that understanding. Know what's weird? Day by day, nothing seems to change, but pretty soon, everything is different. You just go about your business, and one day you realize you're not the same person you used to be. People change whether they decide to or not. So this is kind of the scary side of change. If you don't embrace change and you don't embrace flow, it can be a very frightening and scary thing. So we usually talk about it as impermanence, but you can also think of it as being interconnected with others, being one. So Hobbes says, still making snow art? And Calvin says, yep. Yesterday your sculpture melted. This time I'm taking advantage of my medium's impermanence. This sculpture is about transience. As this figure melts, it invites the viewer to contemplate the evanescence of life. This speaks to the horror of our own mortality. So that's very insightful. And now there's a sense of joy and peace from that insight. This is a gift. I'm so happy it works in PowerPoint. So here again, Reverend Doami and Calvin and Hobbes finds Buddhism in the cracks on a sidewalk. Let's say life is this square of the sidewalk. We're born at this crack, and we die at that crack. Now we find ourselves somewhere inside the square, and in the process of walking out of it, suddenly we realize our time in here is fleeting. Is our quick experience here pointless? Does anything we say or do in here really matter? Have we done anything important? Have we been happy? Have we made the most of these precious few footsteps? So it's a very deep question, but now they're stuck. They're stuck with this question. So, this can be frightening, but this is kind of the beginning of the spiritual path, is to have a really profound question like this. So it's not so much the minister giving you the answer, but each one of us has to find this nagging question that will propel us along our path. And I call this is a technical religious term. You'll learn it in religious studies classes. A good question gives you the Heebie Jeebies. Hobbes, I can't figure out this death stuff. Why did that little raccoon have to die? He didn't do anything wrong. He was just little. What's the point of putting him here and taking him back so soon? It's either mean or it's arbitrary, and either way, I've got the Heebie Jeebies. Why is it always night when we talk about these things? So, on one hand, Calvin and Hobbes is realizing they're finite. They're very finite. And things don't last, and it's frightening. But then the opposite side of that is a realization that we may be finite, but we're part of this infinite flow of life. That there is something permanent, and it's this flow of being part of life, this dynamic process that we're all part of, and this oneness we feel. If people sat outside and looked at the stars each night, I'll bet they'd live a lot differently. How so? Well, when you look into infinity, you realize that there are more important things than what people do all day. Those are shooting stars. So this is one thing that nature does for us. It happened to me when I looked at the Grand Canyon. You're overwhelmed. Your brain almost can't fathom the universe. It's beyond rational thought. But in that moment, you feel grounded and you feel part of something bigger, and you begin to not, you feel like you're at home in the universe. So this is Calvin and Hobbes. Every one of their comics, I read a review or a synopsis of Waterston's work. He always presented these nagging, philosophical, existential questions, and then he'd also offer this insightful answer. And so he was always tackling very difficult questions in his comic strips. And it's no coincidence that Reverend Doami gravitated towards those comic strips. When I was at work and frustrated, I gravitated towards Dilbert. My wife got me a book on Dilbert, and I swear, I was like, this is exactly what we do at work. So I wanted to talk a little bit more. When I first came to OCBC, the very first time I came, Reverend Miyagi, we have a slanted, I think this might be a little bit slanted, but our pews are slanted, like a theater. And I was sitting in the back, and Reverend Miyagi came off the Nijin. He went out the double doors. He went out to those front doors. Our hondo's the same basic layout as yours. And he came running through the hondo, and he did a triple jump down the aisle. And I freaked. My eyes were as big as saucers. And I said, they never would do this in a Christian church. I go, Buddhism is great. And I think what Reverend Miyagi's talk that day is that you can't really outdo your limitations. Like, Reverend Miyagi can only jump as far as he can jump, and he's happy with it. He can't jump 29 feet and take on Bob Beeman. It was very ugly triple jump. It wasn't very far. It might have been 10 feet. But for him, that was the best triple jump he could do. And I didn't really know much about Buddhism yet, but I think he was saying that you have to know your limitations and be happy with who you are and not try to be someone different. So Reverend Miyagi, I always kind of felt was kind of the heart of our temple. Reverend Harada gives talks that are surprisingly deep and spiritual. And then Reverend Doami was a little bit more of the intellectual, a little bit dry, a little bit more cerebral. And I felt like they were like 3 legs of a table, right? You have to have 3 legs to hold up a table. So they were kind of like the structure for OCBC, and they gave different talks. One was very warm and gregarious. One was very surprisingly deep and spiritual, and one was a little bit acerbic. I would challenge you. You were kind of on your edge of the seat when Reverend Doami talks, struggling to keep up. And I love the Beatles. Sometimes I like listening to Paul McCartney. He's my favorite. Sometimes George Harrison is my favorite. And sometimes I feel like I need that little bit of a biting commentary from John Lennon. So depending on my moods, each one of those 3 are my favorite. And Ringo is, I don't know, I guess I'm giving a disservice to Ringo. But those 3. And I always thought about OCBC in that same way. I thought of Reverend Miyagi is the Paul McCartney, Reverend Harada is the George Harrison, and I thought Reverend Doami was the John Lennon. And the three of them together created like one voice. They harmonized very well. And when I used to listen to the Beatles, I never could figure out who was singing. And it took me a long time before I realized it's because they were all singing. They were harmonizing. I could never tell. Sometimes it sounded like John Lennon, sometimes it sounded like Paul, sometimes it sounded like George. So the three of them together on that rotation really helped me understand Buddhism. And this is one of the benefits, I think, of this temple as well, is you get to hear different people speak at different times, and you get different perspectives. So there's kind of a debate. Some temples just have one minister, and you can develop a very close relationship with him or her, and they're always here. But you lack that variety of interpretation. So like when I went to UCLA as a math major, I took different teachers for different subjects, and I got a well-rounded appreciation of mathematics because each teacher had their own approach. And I felt very lucky that we had that at OCBC. And I also found out that Reverend Doami didn't talk that much, but when he talked, it really meant a lot. At his funeral, they said that Reverend Doami loved John Lennon. And there was a picture of him in his video eulogy where he looked a little bit like John Lennon. Like he had these John Lennon glasses on. And I have some John Lennon glasses with me. I can show them to you, but my face is too round. And if you have a round face, you can't wear round glasses. So John Lennon had a very narrow face. And in 1980, when John Lennon was shot and killed, I was at UCLA and my mom called me on the phone and said, John Lennon's just been shot and killed. And I really almost dropped out of school because I just thought, what are we doing? What is the point of all this? And if I had known about Buddhism, I might have gone to IBS, but I had nowhere to go, so I stayed in school. But they said during his funeral that he actually held a memorial service in 1980 for John Lennon after he was shot. And I so wished I could have gone to that. I wished I could have gone to that service. So it's kind of interesting how everything all kinds of fit. So he was a huge admirer of John Lennon. He really helped us at our temple. He didn't talk a lot, but when he did, you were kind of on the edge of your seat. And I really appreciated him. I sat next to him because of the hierarchy. I couldn't sit next to Reverend Miyagi because he was the head minister. And I couldn't sit next to Reverend Harada because he was a resident minister. And then Reverend Doami always sat over there, and I always sat next to Reverend Doami because I wasn't a full-time or part-time minister yet. So I always got to hang out with Reverend Doami. I always got to chant with him, and his chanting was always really deep, really profound. He kind of had his own style of chanting. He didn't chant like any other minister, but his pitch was perfect for me. So I really felt a connection with Reverend Doami. And these teachers are very important in our lives, and if you listen to them over time, they have a big effect. I think I appreciate Reverend Doami much more in hindsight maybe than I did at the time. But I just wanted to share this with you and how he approached Buddhism. It's a way of seeing, just like in that selected reading. If we look at things one way, we suffer. If we look at them with wisdom and insight, we find joy. And Shinran actually talked about dancing. You're so happy with your insight that you actually do a little jig, just like Calvin and Hobbes. So please join me in Gasho.